The funnel is in the chat engines, ChatGPT, Perplexity, Google AI mode, and you need to be top of algorithmic mind throughout that funnel process in order to get the perfect click at the bottom of that funnel process. And to do that, you need to optimize your content for the algorithmic trinity, knowledge graphs, LLM chatbots, and web search. And you need to focus on your entire digital footprint and not just your website. Your website is a representation of your brand that allows you to give your version of the story and point out, creating the infinite loop of self-corroboration to all of the information out there that will help the algorithm answer the question, solve the problem, and make sure you are top of algorithmic mind throughout that funnel process and you get the perfect click, not the competitor. Hi, I'm Jason Barnard, and this is SEO in 2026.
Jason, what's your number one SEO tip for 2026?
I'm going to explain to you how any marketer can optimize for AI-assistive engines. People call it generative engine optimization. I call it AI-assistive engine optimization. Whichever name you use, the principle is very simple, and it's called the Algorithmic Trinity.
Why do you call it the AI-assistive engines?
Because they're assistive engines, they're assisting you to find solutions to your problems, answers to your questions. Generative engine optimization describes how they function as opposed to what they do for you. You could also call them recommendation engines or conversational assistant engines, but they're assistant more and more.
So are you just talking about ChatGPT, Perplexity there as well, or are you lumping together Google and other search engines as well?
Google AI mode, ChatGPT, Perplexity, Copilot. And I also call them assistive engines because I think people aren't realizing that you have explicit search like Google. You have implicit research where you're researching a topic and these assistive engines will bring you up in the conversation. So you start talking about knowledge panels and it says, oh, Jason Barnard knows a lot about that. But then you have implicit research. And I'm going to release an article soon about that, where these AI assistive engines are being integrated into Gmail, into Windows, into Google Docs, into Canva. And they're going to assist people within the applications they're working in. And that becomes ambient research, where your brand name can pop up in a conversation in somebody's workflow, and you have no way of knowing.
I love these phrases that you come up with. Ambient research. I'm almost Googling that as we speak. But as I do, you also share that you have to optimize your digital footprint for the algorithmic trinity. Another lovely phrase. What is the algorithmic trinity?
Right. Well, when we talk about AI assistive engines, Google AI mode, ChatGPT, Perplexity, Copilot, they all work on the same three technologies: knowledge graphs, large language model chatbots, and web search. That's the algorithmic trinity. So whichever flavor you choose, they're using those three technologies as the underlying way they deliver their answers. And the difference between them is to what extent they use each one in generating the answer. And I'll give you an example. Perplexity is essentially a large language model reading search results and summarizing them for you with very little fact checking using a knowledge graph. ChatGPT was essentially a large language model that then added search. And Google AI mode is actually the mix of all three because they use their knowledge graph to fact check, the large language model Gemini to have the conversation, and the web index to get the most recent information.
So does that mean that Google AI modes deliver the best results?
Google are way ahead of the field because they have the best knowledge graph. So if you look at it this way, the knowledge graph is the encyclopedic fact checker. So if you want to stop hallucinations, your knowledge graph is the solution. You need a knowledge graph. Microsoft have a huge knowledge graph. Google have a huge knowledge graph. And I will bet my bottom dollar ChatGPT and Perplexity are building their own knowledge graphs. I've built a knowledge graph at Calicube. If I can do it, they can do it. They've got a lot more money and a lot more super talented developers. Then the large language model gives the machine the capacity to have a conversation with the user. And Fabrice Canel from Bing explained to me that Copilot is designed to bring the user down the funnel to what they call the perfect click. So the conversational engine is saying, okay, what's your problem? Having an exchange with me saying, okay, let's dig down into that. Let's figure out exactly what you're looking for. It won't send the visitors to your website. What it will do is figure out what the perfect click looks like for your particular problem. And it will do that by using, first of all, its own internal knowledge from its training data. It will add to that search results to get up-to-date information or information it didn't have in its training data, or to reassure itself that the training data is in fact reasonably up-to-date and factually correct in terms of what the web is currently saying. And then it will use a knowledge graph to fact-check anything it can to avoid hallucinations and make sure that it's delivering the correct solution, the best solution to the problem.
So by the perfect click, are we talking about the ideal user at the ideal time looking for the ideal piece of content?
Yeah. So you might be the ideal user for me by saying, tell me about knowledge graphs to ChatGPT. ChatGPT will then explain knowledge graphs to you. Start that again. Knowledge panels. Talking about knowledge panels, it will then say, this is what a knowledge panel is. As it's saying that, it's going to be explaining it from resources it already has. It doesn't necessarily know where it got the resource from because it's part of the training data. But my aim is for it to start associating my name with that topic. So that's topical authority that Cure Gabor talks about. Top of funnel. I need to be top of algorithmic mind at that point so that when the person says, who can help me with that, I'm one of the names it will give the user. That's middle of funnel consideration. Then the user says, okay, push comes to shove, who should I choose? Jason Barnard, CaliCube, that's the perfect click. They click on the link, go straight to the service page, sign up, buy. Because they've been convinced, or they've been brought down the funnel, and then convinced by the machine that Jason Barnard and CaliCube are the best solution for a Google Knowledge Panel.
So you mentioned that you think that ChatGPT is building its own knowledge graph. Why would it be doing that? And also, if we're an entity, if we're a brand, what can we do to try to ensure that it perceives our brand in the way that we want it to?
The reason that I believe they're building a knowledge graph is that they would be completely foolish not to, because their technology can't fact check without one. And looking at Google, with Search Generative Experience, Google was actually citing the knowledge graph as a source of information in Search Generative Experience back in the day. And that was their fact checking. But the way to optimize is really simple. And that's the beauty of this, is for an SEO, this is all going to be very much bread and butter, because they all use the same data source, which is the web. So it actually doesn't matter to what extent ChatGPT is or isn't using a knowledge graph, because your web presence, your digital footprint that you talked about earlier, is going to feed the large language model and the knowledge graph and the web index in the same way. So the key that you have is, I can control my own digital footprint. I need to optimize my own digital footprint, which is my entity home website, plus every single asset out there that talks about my brand.
You mentioned the phrase digital footprint there as well. And you also talk about duplicating your digital footprint on your own web property. What do you mean by that? And what benefit does that offer?
I used to talk about entity home web pages. So it would be the about page for the entity, which is the reference, the canonical URL for the entity. John Muir from Google talks about the point of reconciliation for an entity. And the algorithms are actively looking for that. So it's the about page on your own website that you control, where you tell your version of the story, link out to all the corroborative sources, and create what you actually called the infinite loop of self-corroboration. I think that was last year or the year before. And that is incredibly powerful for building a knowledge panel. Getting in the knowledge graph, getting a knowledge panel, the infinite loop of self-corroboration based on the entity home canonical URL point of reconciliation. Bob's your uncle, you get a knowledge panel. Anybody can have a great knowledge panel. It's just a question of, does Google understand you? Same thing with Bing. Does Bing understand you? If you take that a step further and you say, my entire website is the source of information for my brand, it becomes the canonical resource for my brand, for myself as a company, myself as a person, or my own company. In which case, you can do exactly the same thing with the entire website, that you did with the entity home for the entity itself. So you can have a page of articles by me, link out to them all. These are all indeed articles by me. That reassures the machine that it has correctly identified me as the author of those articles on Search Engine Land, for example, or SEMrush, or Slido, or WordLift, or Authoritas for that matter. You can do the same with videos, with webinars, with podcasts. So what you're effectively doing is indicating all of the resources around the web that are indeed you and linking out to them with relevant anchor text to explain how that fits into your digital identity.
So if ChatGPT, Perplexity, other AI search engines don't have an active knowledge graph of their own, potentially, that they're using at the moment, how are they going about determining what to include within the results, and how do you skew your brand towards actually appearing in those results?
Well, I wrote an article recently that you can actually apply graph theory to all three, to the knowledge graph, to the LLM chatbot, and to the web index. So a knowledge graph is the practical example of graph theory. You have entities with attributes and relationships between the entities. The stronger, the closer, the longer the relationship between the entities, the better. And you build up confidence in understanding in the knowledge graph, which is one of the ways you can expand your knowledge panel and get it to become A, richer, and B, trigger more reliably when somebody searches your name or your company name. If you look at a large language model chatbot, you are a parameter in the LLM. So the equivalent to an entity in an LLM is a parameter. And you can strengthen that parameter over time by feeding more and more information that corroborates what you're saying. And then the attributes to that parameter are other parameters. And then the relationships between the parameters are the vectorial space between them. So you can actually look at an LLM chatbot and your optimization for that LLM chatbot as a very similar approach to knowledge graph optimization and knowledge panel optimization.
How much value is it to appear in these AI search engines compared with Google search? Can you actually measure the impact that appearing actually has on your brand?
Well, there's a huge problem of opaqueness in these chat environments, the conversational environments where they're bringing people down the funnel, because you don't know what the conversation looks like. You can know what the kickoff question might be, but how the conversation then evolves is completely unique each time, or pretty much. So you have no visibility, no way of tracking. What you can do is track terms that you feel or questions that you feel are likely to be asked. And Authoritas have an amazing tool for that I super duper recommend. We've been playing around with it, and it has an amazing capacity to identify who you're selling to, how you're selling to them, and what questions they're going to be asking. And then it tracks that. But obviously you're just tracking a sample set rather than what we could track before, which was keywords in Google. What we're doing at Kalicube is measuring the visits from ChatGPT and other AI-assistive engines through Google Analytics. And we have had a 31% month-on-month uplift just since last month. And what I've seen from clients is the conversion rate from ChatGPT is between 10 and 20 times higher than it is from Google search.
Conversion rate meaning likely purchase rate?
Yeah, you get less visits, but you get a much, much higher conversion rate. In fact, one client said to me 100 times, but I find that hard to believe.
And is this across different verticals or different categories of businesses?
We're very much in the B2B space. We help entrepreneurs and their companies within the B2B space. So measurement is very difficult. What I actually do now is when somebody comes on a call, I ask, how did you find us? And pretty much everybody says, I researched the topic, I asked ChatGPT, and I used Google search, and then I used ChatGPT, or I used Google AI mode, and your name kept coming up, your red shirt kept coming up. And when I asked it, who do you actually recommend? It said Jason Barnard without a doubt.
Yeah, well, because a follow-up question I was going to ask is, what's your hypothesis on why there's this 10x rate in terms of likely purchase as a result from a a visit from ChatGPT versus Google? And is it because people use Google or are more likely to use Google in the early research phase and then go to ChatGPT and be much more confident in making a final decision based upon the fact that they're further down the purchase decision making?
Well, the reason that the conversion rate is so much higher is because you're getting the perfect click. The ChatGPTs of the Perplexity, the AI mode of this world have guided the user down the funnel and presented them with what Fabrice Canal from Bing calls the perfect click. So the conversion rate is significantly higher because the person is ready to buy. And the last thing they did before clicking on that link was get an explicit recommendation from the machine that they trust. They don't use the machine if they don't trust it. I'll give you a really quick example that you'll enjoy. I'm a bass player and I have a bass amp. But I wanted to play my guitar, but I didn't want to buy a new guitar amp. So I asked ChatGPT, if I play my guitar through my bass amp, will I break the bass amp? ChatGPT said, no, you won't break the bass amp, but it will sound terrible. So I said, okay, how do I stop it sounding terrible and make my guitar sound really nice through my bass amp? ChatGPT said, you need a compressor, you need an equalizer, and you need reverb. Brilliant. Okay. What do you recommend as a solution to that particular problem? You need to buy 3 pedals for your guitar, the effects pedal for your guitar through the bass amp. Here are 3 really, really good suggestions. And it gave me 3 suggestions. I said, okay, how much is that going to cost me? $250. I said, can you find me something cheaper that's going to be pretty much as good for somebody who isn't a professional musician, who won't really care about the incredibly amazing quality of the Moog compressor? Said, well, yeah, you can have this for $125. You can get these 3 pedals and it'll do the same job. And unless you're a professional, you won't notice the difference. Brilliant. Where can I buy that? Answer, if you're in America, buy it from Sweetwater. If you're in Europe, buy it from Thomann. Give me the link to Thomann. Link to Thomann, bought the 3 pedals, 20 minutes. From starting with a problem, can I even play my guitar through the bass amp, to solving the problem with a purchase from Thomann in Europe.
And is that you because you're a techie geek, or can you see the majority of people moving to that kind of communication process in the future?
I think people are already moving that way. I don't think it's going to be immediate because people are or tend to be slow to change their behavior. But Fabrice Canal, once again, I keep talking about him because I had a really long conversation with him a few months ago, was saying supply creates its own demand. And that's a really old economic term, which I've got a degree in economics, so it's something that really resonates with me. When you provide something like a chat interface to have a conversation, it doesn't necessarily take away from the search. It creates a new use scenario where I'm going to use it in addition to what I had before. And little by little, people will transition across, and Google's going to move people across whether we like it or not. And that idea of supply creates its own demand is very, very, very powerful. So chat interfaces, ChatGPT, Perplexity are not yet replacing search. They're creating additional demand and an additional use case. That is the funnel all in one go by a trustworthy partner who will recommend the best solution, having understood my problem in detail through a conversation.
Jason, what's the key takeaway from the tip you shared today?
The funnel is in the chat engines, ChatGPT, Perplexity, Google AI mode, and you need to be top of algorithmic mind throughout that funnel process in order to get the perfect click at the bottom of that funnel process. And to do that, you need to optimize your content for the Algorithmic Trinity, knowledge graphs, LLM chatbots, and web search. And you need to focus on your entire digital footprint and not just your website. Your website is a representation of your brand that allows you to give your version of the story and point out, creating the infinite loop of self-corroboration to all of the information out there that will help the algorithm answer the question, solve the problem, and make sure you are top of algorithmic mind throughout that funnel process and you get the perfect click, not the competitor.
Jason Barnard is founder and CEO at Calicube. Find out more over at jasonbarnard.com. Jason, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2026.
Thank you, David. That was brilliant.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2026, the book, over at SEOin2026.com.